Okay, good afternoon. Welcome from the UNEP-FI Secretariat. My name is Simone Dettling. I lead our banking work here at UNEP-FI. The aim of today's call is to give you some more details about a new pilot project that we're planning on putting together a group of first mover banks to jointly pilot the implementation of the FSB task force's recommendations on climate-related financial disclosure. So we give you some idea of the project structure, timeline, goals, questions still to be addressed. Towards the end, then also what banks that participate would exactly commit to and the next steps. We will do this in two blocks. So we will first introduce the project in some more detail, and then we'll have a round of questions and comments specifically about understanding of the project, its outcomes, its goals, its structures. And then in the second block, we would talk specifically about what we would expect participating banks to commit to and what the next steps are for those banks who are interested in participating. In terms of housekeeping, as I said, we will have two moments for questions and comments after the first block and after the second block. At the moment, all of you are muted. There are two ways in which you can make comments and questions. The first one is to raise your hands, and you can do that in the interaction box on the right side of your screen. And once we see that, we can unmute you, and then you can make your comment or your question. The other way is to put your comment or question in the question or chat box in writing, and then we would read it out here. Both is absolutely fine. If you have the possibility, sometimes it is nicer to have a bit more spoken interaction. If you want to raise your hand, that would be fantastic. For your information, we will record this webinar. It will not be published externally. We're merely recording it for other UNEP-FI members, so it will be put on the UNEP-FI extranet, which is password protected, so that members who couldn't join today but are interested can actually listen to the recording. With that, I would actually hand over to my colleague Remco Fischer, who is going to introduce you to the project.
Okay, thank you, Simone, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I see we have actually over 30 people registered or attending the webinar this afternoon. We had another 20 roughly this morning. People are still trickling in. So this will mean that we will have briefed through these webinars over 50 people today, which is a very good turnout, considering that this is a webinar only for UNEP-FI members. And not only that, it's only for the banking membership at UNEP-FI. So the great turnout obviously testifies the importance of the TCFD and of this project. So thank you very much for joining. Before we go into the details of the project, just a quick warming up on where does the actual TCFD process stand and what does that and how does our project here and the working group, the UNEP-FI working group that we will be discussing today fit into that overall TCFD, that global really TCFD process. There's the TCFD recommendations, the first draft have been out since December. There's been a public consultation period until February. Some UNEP-FI members have participated in that consultation, and we've been able also as a UNEP-FI Secretariat to put our hands on some of those UNEP-FI submissions and consolidate them also into one more centralized UNEP-FI submission that can be found on our UNEP-FI website. So to those who contributed, thank you very much. The next steps are that following the consultation, obviously the recommendations will be adjusted. The expectation is that they will not be radically adjusted. They will be edited only marginally. So we can assume that the recommendations that will be final will be quite similar to the recommendations we see at the moment. And they will be final in June, when the TCFD submits the final version of the recommendations to the FSB, and then the expectation or the hope really is that despite, of course, some probably political opposition from parts of the world, that the FSB nevertheless will welcome the recommendations. Following that, the TCFD will continue existing for another year or so, and they will be entirely focused then on adoption. So ensuring that the stakeholders who are addressed in the recommendations are indeed starting to disclose their climate-related risks in alignment with the recommendations, and that process is accelerated as much as possible. And this really is where we, as UNEP-FI, as a platform of financial institutions, come in, and where this project comes in as a project aimed at facilitating adoption and catalyzing adoption of the recommendations by the finance sector specifically. Of course, having one of the key features, I'd say, of the TCFD is that it makes, probably for the first time, coming from the FSB, it makes the link between climate-related risks and financial stability. So it asks the question, could climate-related risks, if they accumulated too much in the finance sector, and if following that accumulation they were triggered, could they actually pose a danger to financial stability? And that's obviously a very interesting, a very timely question. And that's also the reason why the finance sector, so the UNEP-FI constituency, so people today on the webinar are front and center when it comes to the TCFD recommendations. Financial institutions are being asked to disclose, but we all know that finance sector disclosure is fairly new. It's complicated, far more so than disclosure in the real economy, and that's why we feel as UNEP-FI we need to make an intervention. And we also feel that we have the required track record for us to be doing so. We've been working on finance sector sustainability disclosure for many, many years. It started off with very broad reporting, sustainability reporting guidelines for the finance sector in partnership with the Global Reporting Initiative. Over time, the focus was sharpened and increasingly so on climate-related risks, in particular carbon-related risks, so the risks related to the transition to the low-carbon economy, as you can tell from the publications here. All these publications that you see, obviously they're public knowledge. You can go onto the UNEP-FI website, download them. They're probably good background reading also for anyone interested in the TCFD and this project. More so, one of the publications you see here, the Carbon Asset Risk Discussion Framework, was used by the TCFD in informing its deliberations, and it's been quite nicely referenced in the TCFD report. Last point on this slide is that as UNEP-FI, we're actually already doing two things at the same time, looking firstly at disclosure. So how can financial institutions measure, capture, assess, and disclose their risk exposures? But then also through one particular platform, we're raising the question of how financial institutions can then take the subsequent step, which is reducing, mitigating those risk exposures that they've measured and disclosed in the first step. And that's what we're doing through, you'll see that at the right side of the slide here, we're doing it for investors only at the moment through the PDC. We've been in discussions with some UNEP-FI members in our climate advisory group and our banking committee on this project idea. We've obviously consulted it, and it's been signed off. We've also been in discussions with the TCFD Secretariat, which, as you know, is hosted at Bloomberg. And what they've told us is that UNEP-FI should do something with three objectives. The first objective is, and the FSB or the TCFD Secretariat was very glad to see us doing this, is for us to support the finance sector's signal back to the TCFD, back to the FSB, that what they're doing on climate risk transparency goes in the right direction. And this is something that will benefit the finance sector and financial stability in the long term. And us doing this project will contribute towards the goal. Secondly, the TCFD report provides some degree of granularity when it comes to guidance for specific sectors, including the finance sector, on what they ought to be disclosing on. It goes even as far as to propose a number of metrics. But for those of you who have seen the report, you will have seen that it falls short actually of providing detailed guidance that was detailed enough for actually a bank to really start disclosing. And through this working group, we're aiming to help banks achieve that, to add that granularity and detail that still is missing from the TCFD report. And then lastly, one of the main mantras actually in the TCFD report and in the disclosure agenda more broadly is the need for harmonization, the need to standardize how disclosures are done so that they can be mainstreamed into financial reporting at some point, and they can then be taken up into things such as equity valuation, valuation models, and so on. And UNEP-FI getting together not one financial institution, but a whole group of financial institutions looking at disclosure will almost automatically make a contribution towards harmonizing and standardizing risk disclosures. In terms of those three elements were probably kind of, what the big picture achievements that we'd like to make as UNEP-FI. But then there's, we believe, a set of very tangible benefits that FI members, in this case banks, will derive from joining this effort. Firstly, I think it will considerably reduce the disclosure costs per financial institution. Why is that? You could argue that disclosure and FI disclosing will be something that will be quite different from one FI to the other, and that's true. But it is very likely that all FIs, or a great number of FIs, will face the same challenges. They will require the same outside expertise. They will require the same inputs from the outside to be able to report. And that outside expertise, those outside resources, if procured and secured and developed jointly by a group of financial institutions, will of course reduce the resulting cost per financial institution. The second and third benefits are that it's a new area. We're talking about disclosure here. We're talking about FIs going public with information that is commercially sensitive. And so this group, we believe, will provide a more intimate setting where this type of information can be, and the interpretation of the information that gets disclosed can be tested by FIs in private before actually going fully public with it. And I think that will provide a lot of comfort to FIs as they prepare their public disclosures. And lastly, I think all FIs will be interested in helping shape that emerging standardization of climate risk disclosure that I mentioned in the previous slide. So having said that, this is the big picture type framing of our idea here. We'll now move into a little bit more the details of what we're envisioning the project to look like. And then later on, as Simone said, we will look also at what we think we would expect from the FIs who decided to join the group. What will be requirements for participation and the commitments expected. So I'll hand it back to Simone.
Thank you very much, Remco. So the project in a nutshell would be a group of 10 to 20 first mover banks coming together to pilot a subset probably of the recommendations that we will agree upon as a group and jointly address the challenges that the implementation of the recommendation brings up. That will mean that we will jointly develop scenarios, models, methods, metrics, and conduct research as needed. And at the end of the project, that we as Secretariat will compile the created scenarios, metrics, models, etc., together with case studies from each of the participating banks to publish this as guidance for others in the industry, so it can be taken up by the industry more widely, and also as, in a way, feedback to the TCFD. What would broadly be the roles of the Secretariat versus the banks? So what we would do is that we would facilitate group exchange, peer learning, joint problem solving with formats like webinars, calls, in-person meetings, sub-working groups. We would also bring in and manage the collaboration with relevant outside expertise. So that means, for example, setting up partnerships with universities, think tanks, NGOs, institutions that can provide relevant insights and expertise to this project. We would be project managing what we outsource to external experts, so probably the development of climate scenarios, metrics and methodologies to measure them, models. And of course, at the end, we would be compiling the jointly developed work and your case studies, and we'd be leading on the publication process. What banks would be doing, what your role would be, is of course to actually pilot the implementation of the agreed upon recommendations internally. So to take what we developed together and test this internally with your own data, to of course contribute your experiences and your great expertise to developing joint solutions, working with external experts. The participating banks would jointly fund the external experts and consultants that we would need for this project. You would be expected to provide materials for the case studies, and of course it would be fantastic to have you involved in presenting and positioning the results of our joint work towards the rest of the industry and the regulators. So what would the envisioned steps and timeline of such a project look like? We're in March now, having the info webinar today. And starting today, we would ask interested banks to put up their hands and signal their interest. This will be a non-binding signaling of interest. We would like you to do that because we would love to spend the next 6 to 7 weeks having one-on-one calls with those banks interested in participating, because we will not only need to work with one person in each bank, but with people from many different teams and departments, and we think it is very important that everybody that will be involved understands the project, has the right expectations, and understands what they commit to also in terms of time. And then by 15th of May, we would ask for a final declaration of interest, and then in the second half of May constitute the working group. In June, as Remco alluded to earlier, the final recommendations will come out and we can start our work, and the very first step will be for us as a group to make decisions on the exact scope of the project. And in order to not have that so abstract, what do we mean when we talk about scope? Well, we will need to decide together which recommendations we want to include. They're recommendations on governance, on strategy, on risk, and on targets and metrics. We can work on all of them, but we might choose to work on a subset that has a specific focus on the more quantitative elements of disclosure. Then we need to decide if we want to look at transition risk only or also at physical risk. And in physical risk that is very broad, what specifically we would want to look at there. There will have to be made decisions in terms of how much we go into specific industries and sectors and how much we keep things abstract across sectors. There will be decisions to be made between global approaches, global metrics, global models, and models that incorporate regional specificities, especially if we look at physical risk. We might need to do specific work per regions, maybe have subgroups there. So that will be a decision how much we go into that. And then, of course, what scenarios would we have? How many parameters would we look at in a scenario? And what parameters, for example, would we look at reduction in rainfall? Would we look at projected changes in the energy mix? How ambitious would the scenarios be? Would it be a 1.5 degree scenario or maybe a 3 degree scenario? And also, do we want to test for the unexpected? Do we want to look at potential shocks, environmental shocks, sudden changes in policy, or do we more want to have slow onset scenarios where we look at a gradually changing status quo? So those will be some of the questions to address when we jointly decide on the scope. And from that will follow, of course, our work plan, and the final decisions on which partners and experts we want to work with will, of course, be already preparing that a little over the next few months. Then, of course, we will set up those collaborations, procure the experts, and then we can move really into the research and the development of scenarios, of metrics, of methods together with external experts. And again, to not leave this too abstract, we need to get from scenarios, data, and models to values for our disclosure metrics. And just some examples on what questions will be answered, what tasks will be delivered through the research we will do together. There will have to be research to determine, and that can be individually or collectively, but parameter values. So what, for example, technology mix are we going to expect in a certain year? What prices for CO2 or fossil fuels will we work with in the scenarios? What policy implications will we assume? And that, of course, needs to be scientifically based, needs to have a good foundation. Also, we would have to work on variables in the sense of what exposure variables do we choose, which ones are most relevant at the level of the client or investee, and also at the level of the portfolio. And then, of course, bringing all this together, we need, together with the outside experts, to develop models that are able to translate the developed scenarios, the parameters that we get out of those, into potential portfolio impact and sensitivities. And that will be, in the end, what will be disclosed. Of course, all this research will go hand in hand with the banks implementing or piloting the implementation of these recommendations, and that will come along with exchange in experience. There will no doubt be challenges. We'll find joint solution for those challenges. And then at the end of approximately 9 or 10 months, we would start compiling all the outcomes we've developed together, as well as case studies from the participating banks in terms of how did you go about this, what challenges did you incur, what solutions and approaches did you go with in the end. So that's, for now, an overview over the project. We will open for comments and questions now, to really make sure, A, that this is well understood, but also that we get your feedback on possible adjustments to the project design. Please, at this point, hold off a little bit on questions around what exactly will we commit to, how much time will we commit to, because that we will talk about then in the next block. Okay, so now's the time to either raise your hands and we will unmute you, or to put some questions into the question box.
We're giving people another 60 seconds or so to come up with questions. Again, either we can unmute you and you can voice your questions, or you can type them in the questions box before we proceed with the presentation.
So we have received a question from Caitlin. The question is, some of us have already taken significant steps. Will these be taken into account? I would say, Caitlin, that is fantastic. I think that would definitely be something that the group would be very happy about and could build on. So yes, it will be absolutely taken into account in the sense that it can be already a first step, a first building block in our joint efforts. And now I see a second question from you, or will we be starting from scratch? What if the group decides to go a different direction? I mean, generally, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, and we will build on everything that we can get from within the membership and from outside experts. So my assumption would be that there would be building on what you've already done. If the group very strongly feels that what you have done, the approach you've taken, is not helpful for the rest, that might be another matter, but I would be surprised. Remco, what would you say?
Well, I think to start with, everything that gets discussed within the group and gets advanced through the group will be within the remit of the TCFD recommendation. So I don't think that there will be, a great danger of us having to basically, herd cats in terms of, various financial institutions wanting to go in radically different directions. I think we will allow, of course, for some flexibility on more technical issues that certain FIs might want to do differently than others. I think that will be inbuilt in the project. We're not expecting that each FI will focus entirely on the same, say, scenario parameters, because they will be exposed to their own geographic and sectoral context. So that flexibility must be there. But at the same time, of course, we do want to create a common denominator. Otherwise, the discussion is impossible. So I think we will have to see case by case how we deal with I guess very specific needs of specific FIs in specific contexts. There's a next question from Beatriz Puello. Is it possible to estimate the cost of expert consultants and the size of the work group that the bank will have to provide? So I think there's two questions there. One is, do we have an estimate for the overall cost of the elements of the development of the external third-party development of elements that will be required? We have a first kind of ballpark figure there, which is in between 300,000 and 500,000 US for the entire group and for the entire duration of the project, which would include things like developing scenarios or fine-tuning scenarios, calibrating scenarios, developing, and then developing the models that, as Simone was saying, connect the scenarios with FI-specific portfolio level data. And for us to be doing it that in a satisfactory manner, that's the type of overall funding I think we will require. There's the next question.
Yes, just maybe to the second part.
The second part. So in terms of the size of the working group, I think, so one thing is the size of the working group, the UNEP-FI working group, which is which we are envisioning to be in between 10 and 20 FIs. We think that's a good balance between getting sufficiently large number of FIs for things like achieve things like standardization, for instance, and to get also perspectives from different parts of the world, while not overburdening kind of the project management capacities that we have here at UNEP-FI. In terms of the people within the FIs, so on your side, they would have to be mobilized and engaged. I think that will be quite different from FI to FI, but certainly it would have to involve team members, colleagues from departments such as risk, strategy, public relations, sustainability. So I could already think of at least 3, 4, 5 parts of any given FI that would have to be engaged in the process. There's another question?
Yes, Hui, that's more a comment. Hui, you're writing that Curtis mentioned in a recent presentation that the task force is considering providing 2 scenarios for all companies to use. That would be fantastic in terms of standardization. We have to see what parameters these scenarios work with. And then, of course, what comes in between the middle part, the model that actually takes the scenario and understands or describes how companies are vulnerable to the scenario and then translates that into how FI are vulnerable through the companies, that would still be a major part of work. You having been with City part of the drought stress testing tool, I think you have a very good grasp of how work-intensive and difficult this whole part of vulnerability, of translating from scenario to portfolio impact is. So yeah, if they already have scenarios like we can build on, that would be fantastic. Lara is asking how many financial institutions for the regional group we would include. Lara, let me know if I'm not answering the question correctly. What I'm understanding is how many do we take from each region. We have to see how many banks want to participate, and generally we do aspire to have a good regional distribution. So we haven't come up with any like specific limits. Yeah, so I think having too many from several regions is a luxury problem that we will deal with once it arises. So far there is no limit, but as I said, we want some regional distribution to make this to give the legitimacy from as many markets as possible. There is another question from Vetvalia. Has there been any initial discussion with existing agencies like the IEA on scenarios and with regulators on risk, Basel and national regional? I think Remco, you
on the first bit of the question on scenarios, yes. I mean, I think if there's one place where one would find, readily available energy sector transition scenarios, that's the IEA at the global level, and in many instances, I believe, even at the national level. We have a relationship with the IEA. We've not discussed this project with them yet. But we know that some of our banking members, especially the French banking members who are also in Paris, have been in discussions with IEA and have been using their scenarios. So I think involving them and their scenario work in this program would be a no-brainer and fairly easy to achieve. On the second question, I don't think we've engaged yet on this project with regulators on risk. Obviously, UN Environment, through the UNEP-FI and through the inquiry, has a network of regulators, financial regulators that we're engaging on. And so also reaching out to them through those channels on this project should not be a problem. But that's not happened yet. We're assuming, though, that there are efforts by the TCFD Secretariat itself on its recommendations to discuss those also with financial regulators. There's 2 more questions I see from Caitlin. It's one question. It's does the disclosure commitment include company specific disclosure or is this disclosure of the entire working group? I will probably say something about that just in my next slide, Caitlin. So please bear with me until then. I hope I'll clarify your question.
Okay, are there any more questions? Yeah, there are. Pedro is asking, has there been any discussion about this project with other groups that may have similar plans? If so, will UNEP-FI and the other organizations work together in a joint project? So we are not aware that there are plans from any other institutions to do this specifically with banks. What we are aware of is that PRI is organizing a pledge in their Berlin meeting this year for investors to state or to publicly announce that they will disclose on TCFD. Apart from that, we are searching, or we're seeking a meeting with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development to see if they would be interested in furthering this at the corporate side. And then, of course, if there are other institutions working with other financial sectors or the corporates, we would ensure that we coordinate there and that we harmonize as much as possible across different industries and sectors. Maybe Remco, you want to add something there?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that we know that the TCFD Secretariat, as part of their their second-year mandate on adoption, is planning to create user groups, I think they're calling that, along the lines of what we're suggesting here. The facilitation of those working groups, I don't think would be as hands-on and as coordinated as what we're envisioning here. But if they were to come up with one of FIs or of banks, they know that we're doing this. So in that case, yes, we would probably be working together very closely with them on that. Right, there's another question from, I hope that answers your question, Pedro. There's another question from Jeroen at ASN Bank. Are you aware of the activities of the platform Carbon Accounting Financials in the Netherlands? Jeroen, yes, we're aware of those activities that they're focused on, or that they have at least, when the platform was initiated, that the focus was carbon accounting, across actually financial institution types, so not only banks, but it also includes, I believe, pension funds. I'm not aware as to that platform's plans vis-a-vis more explicitly the TCFD and the TCFD recommendations. As you know, the TCFD recommendations for banks do not mention carbon footprinting, nor actually carbon metrics based on greenhouse gas emissions data. They leave it open. For institutional investors, they do mention that. So there's probably a bit of discussion to be had as to how the activities of the Dutch platform might or might not respond to the TCFD recommendations. But if the platform wants to respond, of course, that should be coordinated with our global project. That would not be focused only on Dutch institutions, but of course on institutions from the G20 or beyond.
Okay, these are, I think, all the questions we've received right now. We would proceed to the second part about what we expect from participating banks, and then again we'll have some time for questions, comments, suggestions. So over to Remco.
Yeah, so in terms, I mean, I've touched on this a little bit already in the Q&A part, but what would we be expecting from participating banks? Firstly, there's going to be one main working group. In this working group, each FI will have one representative, which we're referring to as the overall focal point. And the responsibility of that person would be to essentially manage the whole process at the interface of the UNEP-FI working group and everything that might be needed within that person's financial institution. Then secondly, working towards a disclosure of the type envisioned by the TCFD will require that disclosures put in place internal processes, that they mobilize resources and make available resources for those processes, and that might have to happen, as I said before, not in one team, but actually across a variety of different organizational teams. And we would here again expect that banks are prepared to be putting those internal processes and resources in place. Thirdly, we might, in addition to the main working group, we might establish, and the main working group will exist for the entire duration of the project. So this will really be the permanent structure. But there might be technical issues that would have to be addressed, say, through some kind of subcommittee. And within those subcommittees, it might be the case that the overall focal point would not have the required technical expertise, so that the participating bank would have to appoint other relevant technical experts for those sub-technical working groups. You'll see in a subsequent slide that obviously then the time commitment for those people would probably be smaller than the time commitment made by the main focal point. But that's quite self-explanatory, I guess. Fourthly, an important topic is that as Simone was saying in one of her previous slides, the role of the UNEP-FI Secretariat and UNEP-FI resources, which are available at the moment, would be focused on facilitating the process along the lines described. They would not be sufficient, though, to have any of the other elements developed, conceptualized, socialized, etc., that might be required for the success of the working group, such as scenarios. Of course, the scenarios are made available by the TCFD. We would no longer have to develop those, but we would still have to put some work into modeling work. We would have to put some research work into, what are the other variables or parameters at the level of FI's portfolios or within FI's clients and investees that would have to be teased out for modeling. All of that work will have to be funded by, first and foremost, by the participating banks, and obviously we would develop some kind of formula to ensure that the banks with the biggest capacities and with the biggest budgets would provide greater funding potentially than, of course, the banks with a smaller capacity, smaller size, or perhaps banks in developing countries. We're envisioning the contribution by FI to be in between 15 to 25, perhaps even 30,000 US dollars for us to be able to develop all those external elements satisfactorily. Fifth point, what we will need is we're obviously doing this for the benefit of the smaller group, as I said before, and the benefits should be quite clear. But then as a UN organization, we need to be doing this also with a view to informing the broader public, the broader UNEP-FI membership, but then also the broader public beyond the membership. And this will be done through case studies, through obviously us publishing the insights and the lessons learned from the process, including, as I say in point 7 here on the slide, in the form of formal UNEP-FI recommendations back to the TCFD on matters pertaining to finance sector disclosure. And we're expecting that participating banks would, of course, be comfortable with that. Of course, we would not expect confidential information to be disclosed publicly. And so everything that would get disclosed would have to go through a consultation and sign-off process, ensuring that all participating banks were comfortable with things. One important requirement is that, of course, this is a disclosure working group. So at some point, we would be expecting that participating banks would indeed come up with a disclosure. This disclosure does not have to be a full disclosure the first time it is made. It can be a part it can be partly aligned with the TCFD. It doesn't have to be a fully TCFD compliant disclosure, but something needs to obviously come out. And the timeline for that has obviously not determined. Probably it will be determined through the working group, but we'd be envisioning that the first disclosure is made probably not after mid 2019 or so. And point 7, I already mentioned that it's public communication, and especially us, UNEP-FI, in our role as a public partnership, really as a common good partnership, also issuing the recommendations from this private group publicly to the TCFD. Let's look at the time commitments that we are envisioning. So for the overall focal point per FI, we'd be envisioning it's going to be an intensive process. We've been envisioning 1 or 2 conference calls of approximately 60 minutes each per month. Not only that, we would also like to convene an in-person meeting of that working group at some point, and we would of course want to do that somewhere where most UNEP-FI members will be anyway, which would be this year's UNEP-FI AGM, which will take place in the fall in Europe. It's not only though participating in the calls that will be required. We would think that the focal points would have to set aside roughly 5 hours per month to prepare review materials and also prepare obviously interventions and presentations and inputs into the working group, plus the time required for the focal point to be coordinating with team members, with colleagues from other divisions, from other teams at the bank as needed. And then we might have, again, this is not certain, but it's quite likely, we might have technical specialists appointed from different bank departments to join what I mentioned before, these temporary, more technical sub-working groups. Those would not run for the entire duration of the project. Those would probably just run for a fraction of the project, say 2 to 3 months, and would require a total of 4 to 6 calls or so. When it comes to the technical matters, obviously there's going to be also a role for the FIs together with the UNEP-FI Secretariat to provide guidance and inputs to whoever third-party experts we are working with. Again, be it on scenarios, on metrics, on methods, on models, and so on. And that would also be a time requirement. Plus, of course, as with the main focal point, time will have to be set aside to review materials, test the developed deliverables, and that would probably be several hours per month also over the course of that shorter amount of time, 2 to 3 months. So that's the estimated time commitment, I guess, for these 2 profiles, for these 2 roles in the project. And then finally, perhaps there's one final slide, I think, on next steps. So following this webinar, we will issue another written notification by email to all UNEP-FI banking members, and also perhaps the UNEP-FI non-banking members who attended the webinar out of interest, with an elaboration of the terms of reference for participating in the working group and the next steps. The next steps, roughly, in terms of us working towards the constitution of the group, would be that we would be accepting informal or non-binding expressions of interest from interested banks by April 10th. We would then take roughly, as a Secretariat, 6 weeks, so from the beginning of April until mid-May, roughly, to conduct one-on-one calls with those banks who have submitted the non-binding expression of interest to figure out whether there's a match, whether what we're offering really will meet the needs of that financial institution, and whether that financial institution will comply with the requirements of joining the group. We will then expect the submission of binding expressions of interest by 15th May, so that we're able to constitute the working group in its final shape the 2 weeks after. So, and this timeline is, in a way, configured so that by the time there's basically a go-ahead or a green light from the FSB on the final wording of the recommendations, that we can basically kick off fairly quickly.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Remco. We have a few minutes for comments and questions, and on this part specifically, we would also very much like your feedback. This is what we're envisioning so far in terms of the role of the banks, but it would also be very good to understand if you think this is feasible, if there are some expectations we have that you think might be very difficult, and that we might need to adjust now in the planning phase of the project. So yeah, we would very much look forward to your feedback. Same game as before. You can either type a question or a comment, or you can also raise your hand. We'll unmute you. You can talk to us. Whatever is more comfortable for you. I think we'll give it a minute. Okay, thank you very much. We have a first comment from Beatrice. She said she will present the initiative to her head and evaluate if it is possible to participate. That is good news, Beatrice. Thank you very much. And yeah, please do let us know your feedback, and then get back to us if there is interest, and we can arrange a call together with your institution. Okay, any other comments? Or yeah, here we go. Andrew Scott. He's concerned about the time requirement from participating banks. Mobilizing experts and knowledgeable people from various banking areas will not be an easy sell internally, and I fear that the amount of work that will need to be done by the experts, etc., will be considerable. I think two things on that. One is, and I think we've put that down on a previous slide. We would expect that for these experts, doing this jointly in a group, in the end, will save time compared to them figuring it out on their own. Nevertheless, we understand your concerns. I guess in the end, the fewer access we would have to the experts from the banks, the more we would need to get in external expertise, which might raise the cost a little bit. So it might be a little bit a trade-off between financial commitment and time commitment. Andrew, maybe I can just unmute you. I hope that's okay with you, but I'd be very interested in hearing how much time you think they could or would chip in. Andrew, you're unmuted now. Maybe you want to give us a bit of an idea or feedback what we would need to limit this to be realistic for you to sell to your internal colleagues?
Oh, I think that's a bit difficult for me to estimate.
Mm-hmm.
But that I could just see that getting the involvement of people from risk, sustainability, essentially finance, reporting, and other coordinating staff. I mean, very quickly the numbers add up to 6, 7, 8 people, it seems,
Yeah.
in order to do this job right. That would be, you know, I think a pretty substantial commitment.
And I think this will have to.
Sorry, go on.
You know, we're aware of that. That's why we wanted to also be very clear about it from the get-go, so that there is no surprises later on. I mean, I think the degree of involvement of further colleagues, I mean, it is going to be a topic not only, of course, for you, but it will be a topic for each participating FI. And I think we'll just have to find a balance between, yes, not straining your resources and your internal relationship too much, while at the same time us simply being able to do this project. And if the participating banks are under the impression that this can be done without, you know, so many colleagues from other teams, of course it could be considered. But then we would have to have a plan as to how it can be done without them.
Okay. We have a comment here from Rahel. Rahel says, comment on Andrew's concern. I think the estimate is realistic. Thank you very much for that, Rahel. If others want to provide feedback on that as well, that would be very welcome. Otherwise, also to you, Andrew, we will still have the one-on-one calls as well with interested banks, where we can also see with your colleagues if they would invest an hour for such a call, in how far this is also work that they would be engaged in anyways, and this might actually help them, or in how far it is extra work, and can see if for your bank it works to be part of the project, or if it's maybe easier to find another form of participation, a little bit removed from the core group. We have another question here from Rahel. It's a very, very good one. Rahel, you're asking how we think agreement will be reached in a rather large working group. Initially, we envisioned this working group to be maximum 12 people, but we got a lot of interest from a lot of member banks, and our governance body, the banking committee, asked us to make the group a little bit bigger so as to not turn away banks that are willing to really invest the resources needed to participate in the project. So 20 banks would be a lot. I think we would have to adopt an approach that allows for some amount of deviation and maybe some more regional groups. Generally, I think it'll need to be consensus-based, but maybe on different recommendations. Yeah, we can have different groups of banks maybe taking the lead. Once we have the group, I think we will figure that out. Since we only have one representative from each bank, it will be maximum 20 people, so I think still possible to reach agreements. But yeah, we will be flexible and maybe allow a bank or two every once in a while to opt out of implementing one of the recommendations, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah, just one general comment on that in terms of, you know, what we mean with agreement, quote unquote. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, yes, one of the objectives of the working group will be to make a contribution towards standardizing. but I don't think we will really standardize. So we will not basically have to find agreement, in this working group as to how, absolutely things would have to be disclosed. I think I think each bank will be able to make its own choices as to how it decides to disclose. It would just, share the rationale for that choice with the group. It would explain its case, and that would probably then inform other banks and get a discussion going that would inform standardization. Ultimately, though, so we don't have to have, my point is we don't have to have agreement on each single element of disclosure, but to be able to obviously have all banks move in parallel with each other, and for us to be able to get the right inputs for the work, like the right scenarios, the right models. Of course, there needs to be a certain amount of agreement as to what it is that we want to focus on. So do we want the 2 degrees? Well, 2 degrees is obligatory, but do we want a 3-degree scenario, or do some other people just want the 1.5 scenario? I think there we will have to really just negotiate, and we will have to find agreement somehow.
Okay, we have a quick question from Guillermo. So at the moment, we expect that each bank would need to contribute between $15,000 and $30,000 US to the general pot of money to hire experts for this project. I mean, in the end, how much we need depends on the scope we decide on. But we've made this ballpark estimate from the kind of scope we could envision. If in the end the group decides on a smaller scope or a larger scope, we would need to adjust accordingly. For us, it is important that we're able to hire the right and the best experts and to get high quality work. And that will need a sufficient amount of funds. I hope, Guillermo, that this is a sufficient answer for now. As I said, I mean, it's an estimate. In the end, how much money we need will depend on how much the group decides to do in terms of scope and outsourcing things to external experts. We have a question from Beatrice. The TCFD draft report, if you just type TCFD into Google, you get to their website immediately, and under publications, the report is the very first thing you find.
There's various reports. So there's a main report, and then there's another one that I don't remember what it's called, but it's basically the supplemental guidance for specific sectors, which includes also the various financial sectors.
Caitlin, very good question also here. We are also dealing with banks with very different portfolios, small local banks, global mainstream banks. Not a question, but just something to consider. Absolutely. And I think we said earlier already, we would love some geographic diversity. And to a certain extent, we would also be very interested in a diversity of size of bank. Which is one of the reasons that that there might be slightly different contributions for different banks to allow smaller banks to come in. But I think as you mentioned here, in the end, these recommendations and their implementation needs to work for many different types of banks. And I think the more diversity we can have, the better we can assure that this is really relevant and valid for banks all around the world and for different kinds of banks.
Again, I think the balance that will have to be kept in this work is that is one of, on the one hand, allowing for a fair degree of flexibility as to how each individual bank will want to approach things, while at the same time, having some common denominator between the banks. And I think it's possible by developing the types of deliverables that we have in mind at the right level of abstraction, so they don't have to be super specific and super tailored to any given context of a geographic or sectoral or client context. They can also be developed in a more abstract way. So, for instance, we could all agree that doing a 1.5 scenario, would be reasonable. And that 1.5 scenario would apply equally to a large bank and to a small bank. We could also probably agree that it is the same types of features among the clients and investees of banks that will be critical, whether those clients are listed large multinational companies or whether they're, SMEs. Obviously, the values will be different for those parameters, but the parameters are likely to be the same. And this is how we will, I guess, achieve that balance.
Okay, we are a few minutes over time here, and it seems like we went through all the questions in the question box that I can see. So I'll give it a few more seconds if any questions went unanswered or anybody has a last-minute question or comment. But while doing that, I'd already like to thank you for taking the time to attend today's webinar. We are hoping for and looking forward to your expression of interest, to have follow-up calls, one-on-one. We'll send a follow-up email to everybody. Yes, if you have any further questions, suggestions, comments after this webinar, you can reach us via email, phone, etc. We'll be happy to receive something from you. And yeah, with that, I would wish you a good afternoon or rest of the day, wherever you are.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Caitlin. Bye-bye.
Bye.